Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about plants. Specifically, we're going to be talking about plant structure, nutrition, and environmental response. But there's a lot of terminology that goes along with that. So let's take a look at our very first slide. So we've got two words that you need to understand. One is monocot and the other is dicot. So let's take a look at what that means. And basically what we're doing is we're classifying our plants, right? So this is just a means of classification, a naming convention, so nomenclature. So monocots, when we compare the seeds, the roots, the vascular system, the leaf, and the flower in order to classify plants. Monocots, their seeds have one cotyledon. If you follow my cursor here, you can see what I'm talking about. And in dicots, di means two, they have two cotyledons, as you can see here. When we take a look at the roots, monocots have fibrous roots, and dicots have these tap roots. When we look at the vascular system, in monocots, the vascular system is more scattered, and in dicots, it's more ringed. When we look at the leaf pattern, and this is what you're going to see most commonly because this is what we look at when we're looking at plants just sort of out and about on our walks and our hikes or maybe at the nursery, we can see the leaves and the flowers, so the leaves and the flowers. So here, when we see the veins in the leaves being parallel, then that's probably a monocot. When we take a look at the leaves and we see this net-like structure of the veins of the leaf, it's probably a dicot. When we take a look at the flowers and we actually count the flower petals, we can see 1, 2, 3, multiples of 3, it's a monocot. When we take a look at the flowers and we can see that it's multiples of 4 or 5, then it's a dicot. So that's classification. So more terminology and definitions. So you're going to see as we get further into the lecture that I'm going to be using this term called eudicot, which basically just means true dicots, and it includes mostly the plants that were traditionally described as dicots, according to Simpson in 2010. You're also going to hear the word angiosperms when you're sort of out and about and maybe, at the nursery or discussing plants with someone. You may hear the term angiosperm, and this basically just means a plant that produces seeds within an enclosure. In other words, a fruiting plant. And so this term comes from the Greek words angion, which means case or casing, and sperma, which means seed. So angiosperm, a plant that produces seeds. Okay, let's get into looking at the different types of tissues in plants. So plants have tissues too. We typically don't think of them as having immune systems and different tissues just like we do, but they're organisms and they have to function, and they actually do have all of this structure. So let's take a look at the basic tissue types found in all vascular plants. So number one, we've got dermal tissue, and it's basically shown here in this greenish sort of color. And the dermal tissue covers and protects the surface of the plant, just like our dermis does. Then plants have vascular tissue, just as we have vascular tissue. And their vascular tissue transports water and nutrients throughout the plant. They also have what's called ground tissue, and this makes up the bulk of the plant, and it's where most of the plant's metabolic activities are actually being carried out. And so when we take a look at a cross section of the leaf, we can see the three basic tissue types based on coloration here. And if you'll just follow my cursor, this hopefully will help you out if you have difficulty with seeing color. So in this greenish area, this is our dermal tissue, as you can see here. And then in this yellowish coloration, this is depicting the ground tissue, and in this purplish coloration, this is depicting the vascular tissue. Now, the thing to remember is this is not the color of the tissue, right? When we're looking at these illustrations, it doesn't mean that in a plant, their vascular tissue is purple. No, it's not, right? This is just for illustration purposes to help us better visualize these different structures. And so here, when we take a look at the cross-section of a stem, you can see where the different tissues lie. Again, in green here that I'm outlining with my cursor is the dermal tissue. In this yellowish color, we have the ground tissue, and then we have the vascular tissue depicted here in this purplish color. So you can see the architecture, the structure. And again, taking a look at the root system, this is a cross-section. We have the dermal tissue, we have the ground tissue, we have the vascular tissue. Okay. So let's take a look at root structure. So this is taking a look at a Eudicot root, and what we have here is in this greenish color, follow my cursor again, you can see the dermal tissue. In this yellowish coloration, following my cursor, you can see the ground tissue. And then now we're getting into more terminology. We're breaking the vascular tissue into two separate categories. So the vascular tissue is made up of phloem and xylem. So here we have in purple, you can see the phloem region. And here in this tealish color, you can see the xylem region of the vascular tissue. Okay. And then also depicted in this illustration, you can see the root hairs. And root hairs greatly increase the surface area of the root, and that is in contact with the soil. And the root hairs do virtually all of the absorption that occurs in the roots. And so here we're looking at a root cross-section, so you can see, again, the architecture, the structure of the different tissues where they lie. Here, following my cursor in green, we have the dermal tissue, and yellowish, we have the ground tissue. And again, breaking the vascular tissue into its two types, we have the phloem here in purple and the xylem here in this tealish color. And that is the Eudicot root. And when we look at a monocot root, we can see that the structure is different, yet we still have the same tissue types. Okay. So let's talk about the primary function of stems. So we all have seen stems on plants, but let's look closer at what the function of a stem is. So stems provide support and transport infrastructure needed for the distribution of water and sugars and other nutrients in the plant. And so we have leaf positioning. So stems position the leaves where they can intercept the sunlight to carry out photosynthesis. Stems provide structural support, and that's necessary to keep the plant upright, right? Much like our bones give us structure. But then also stems function in distribution. So stems house the plant's vascular tissue through which the water, minerals, and sugars are distributed throughout the plant. So we're going to look closer at stem structure. So here we're looking at a Eudicot stem, and we've got what's this is again terminology. We've got what's called the apical meristem here, and then we've got these different nodes. So this branching here is known as a node. And again, you can see that we've got the three tissue types outlined. So you can see their presence and where they are within the stem. And again, remember the vascular tissue is broken down into xylem and phloem. Sorry, xylem and phloem. So the vascular tissue is broken down into xylem and phloem. And then here we can see the cross section taken of the stem. So again, you can see where the different tissues lie in the stem cross section. This is looking at a Eudicot stem. And we're going to add some more terminology here. So you can see that we have this region called the cortex, And if you follow my cursor, you can see where that is. And then we have a region called the lateral meristem, or the cambium. And you'll hear that the term cambium a lot when people are counting the rings of a tree, right? And then we have the pith. Again, follow my cursor. And the vascular bundles. So more terminology on the anatomy of a stem. We can see that we have the exact same structures here in a monocot stem, except the architecture is a bit different, yet the same structures are present when we take a look at, for example, the vascular bundles. We can see the dermal tissue, we can see the ground tissue, we can see the xylem and the phloem regions. So let's, we talk a lot, or you saw a video talking about hydroponics, right? And that's basically growing plants in a water-based system. They're not in soil. But have you ever thought about why plants actually are in soil? What are they getting from the soil that we actually have to supply when we are performing hydroponics that allows us to take them out of the soil? We still have to give them the nutrients that they require in order to grow. So let's take a look at what these nutrients are and what's happening in the soil so that we know how to actually do these replacements when we're doing hydroponics. So nitrogen fixation. So the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen, the nitrogen that's in the air, into a form that plants can actually use, because they cannot pull nitrogen from the air, but yet they still need nitrogen. So here we've got atmospheric nitrogen. And atmospheric nitrogen doesn't exist in an easily usable form in nature. It must be chemically modified by bacteria for plants to use it. And so bacteria break apart the strong and stable bonds of atmospheric nitrogen. It's N2, so it's two atoms of nitrogen, and plants can't break that. They need bacteria to break those two bonds so that they can actually use it. Now, after the bacteria break apart the atmospheric nitrogen, then bacteria convert it to molecules with one nitrogen atom, which is now usable by plants. So you can see here. So nitrogen is the most common element in our atmosphere, but it's in a form that's not easily used by plants without the help of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So let's look at this alliance between plants and bacteria. So some plants actually secrete bacteria-attracting compounds from their roots. And bacteria enter the roots and move to the inner cells. If you take a look here at the illustration, and they multiply. And they can form these big round lumps called a nodule. So here we see the bacteria, and then we see the nodules, and we can see the bacteria in the nodules. Now, the plant then delivers sugars to the nodule, which serves as a fuel to enable the bacteria to split apart the nitrogen molecule absorbed from the soil. So the plants are actually feeding the bacteria so that they can help them break down the nitrogen that the plant needs. And so the bacteria then produce and release molecules with usable nitrogen into the plant. And then the plant distributes and absorbs the nitrogen throughout the plant body so that it can grow. So there is this really cool alliance between plants and bacteria. So let's take a look at absorbing minerals. Because most minerals are chemically charged, they must pass through transport proteins embedded within the membranes of root cells. So plants still need to absorb minerals. Let's see how that happens. So when the mineral concentrations are greater outside the root cell, here we have the root cell wall, here we have the root cell membrane, we can see that we actually have these channels that are here. So here we're looking at outside the root cell, and then here, follow my cursor, inside the root cell. And so now we're looking at when mineral concentrations are greater outside the cell, then minerals can move down their concentration gradient into the cell, facilitated by diffusion. Remember, when we talk about diffusion, we're talking about the movement of particles, and particles want space. They want to go where there's less particles, right? That's just simple diffusion, and so they can easily diffuse through the channels because of this concentration gradient. There's more here. They want to get to where there's less. That's just diffusion, right? But when mineral concentrations are greater inside the cell, then minerals have to move against their concentration gradient into the cell. And this is where we have active transport. So the plant is going to have to expend some energy in order to move the minerals into the cell, right? Because they're moving against their concentration gradient. And so we have to use some ATP to do that. All right? And plants can do that. Let's talk about water transport. Like, how do we get water from the roots, which are in the ground, to 300 feet in the air, the top of a tree, without a pump? There's no pump to get water all the way to the top of the tree. So let's take a look at how that happens. So we're going to be looking at the cohesion tension mechanism of fluid movement in the xylem. So plants use a cohesion tension mechanism to transport water and dissolve minerals from the roots and circulate that throughout the plant. And so we have this direction of water flow that has to get from the ground, the roots, all the way up, say 300 feet. Just think of a sequoia, how water is getting to the top of those leaves. The direction has to go from the ground up, and there is no pump. So this is how it happens. So number one, it starts with evaporation. So due to the flow of water concentration in the air relative to the water concentration in the leaf, molecules of water are evaporated one by one. So leaves at the very bottom, they have these openings called stoma or stomata, and it looks like a little mouth, and it can open up, right? And when it opens up, what can happen is a water molecule can actually be released through evaporation. So here, take a look at the illustration. Here we have the xylem where we have our water. Remember, that's part of the vascular tissue. And then we have the stomata, that's the opening. And so water basically can be released one molecule at a time through evaporation. And cohesion is where these water molecules are basically attracted to each other, right? It's kind of like, people holding hands in a chain, right? And as one molecule of water is released through evaporation, then because they're holding hands, they're bonded in a chain, it's pulling up the next molecule of water. And so we have this tension. So water molecules from the hydrogen bonds with one another, these bonds basically are helping to move the molecule because they're sticking together. So they're all like holding hands. So as one molecule evaporates, it creates this tension pulling on all the other water molecules that are stuck together, that are bonded, hydrogen bonded together with it. And so it's literally, they're pulling each other up the top of the tree as one evaporates at a time. Okay, so here what you're seeing depicted in the xylem, we have the water, and then you can see the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. Remember that from your chemistry lecture, the bonding of water. That's called cohesion. And basically it's what pulls the water up from the roots to the very top of the tree because of this cohesion tension, which is really cool. So the cohesion or stickiness of the water molecules to each, that's linking them to each other, goes all the way down from the roots all the way up to the top. So as one molecule evaporates and it pulls up the next water molecule next to it, that molecule then pulls up the next molecule next to it, and so on, all the way from the roots to the very top of the tree. And that's what's helping to also pull the water into the roots themselves, right? So super, super cool way to get water from the ground to the very top, 300 feet in the air without a water pump. Without a pump. There's no heart, there's no mechanics. It is all based on this cohesion tension of water. And I release a molecule through evaporation at the very top of the leaf through these stomata, and because of that cohesion tension, it's just pulling it all the way up. That's just fascinating bit of engineering. And so moving heavy fluid, water and nutrients around a plant could be energetically expensive, right? However, the cohesion of water molecules causes them to be pulled through the plant from the root all the way to the leaves as evaporation occurs. All right, so let's take a look at sap storage and transport. So now we're talking the phloem, right? This is the other arm of the vascular system of plants. So throughout the late summer and early fall, sugar from photosynthesis moves down from the leaves and the stems to the roots, where it gets stored as starch. And as the temperature rises in late winter, the starch in the roots begins to break down, and the sugar is then released into the xylem. Okay? And then increased pressure caused by the added sugar moves the sap upward towards the newly forming leaf buds, right? So now we can see the xylem and the phloem at work. Okay, so just kind of follow the molecules here as to what's happening in the late summer and the early fall as our sugars are actually coming from photosynthesis and then moving down from the leaves and the stems to the roots, get stored as starch, and then as the temperature starts to rise in the late winter, starch in the roots begin to break down, and the sugar is released into the xylem. And then this increased pressure because of the sugar in the xylem. Remember, we're talking about everything on the molecular scale, right? If I start adding more sugars, sugar is a fairly large molecule, right? So it's causing this increased pressure. And this is what actually causes the sap to move upward towards the newly forming leaf buds, okay? So sugar from photosynthesis can be stored in the roots as starch, and then later the sugar can provide energy for new leaf buds. So let's take a look at sugar transport. So the phloem controls sugar movement throughout the plant in 4 steps. So step 1, sugar is loaded by active transport into the phloem from sites of production, primarily the leaves, right? So here, let's take a look at our image. Here we've got the xylem. Remember, this is where our water typically is flowing. And then we've got the phloem, and we've got the sugar now being placed into the phloem using active transport, okay? Step 2, the increased sugar concentration in the phloem causes water to move from the xylem into the phloem by osmosis. Remember, water always wants to go where the party is, right? So if I've got more molecules in another region, then osmosis, if I have a membrane that's permeable that allows water to go through, that's where water is going to go, where there's more particles, right? So now this increased sugar concentration in the phloem causes water to move from the xylem into the phloem by osmosis, and this increases the phloem fluid pressure, which makes sense. Put more water in, I have more fluid pressure. Now, the increased phloem pressure causes the fluid in the phloem to move elsewhere in the plant, such as to the roots, much like a tube of toothpaste being squeezed. Okay, so it's moving based on this pressure. And as the sugar is pushed through the plant body, it's moved out of the phloem by active transport at the various locations where it's needed, such as into the root cells for storage and or growth once it gets to the roots. Okay, so that's how sugar is transported in the phloem. But let's look at how plants respond to their environments, because they are super responsive. So we have something called phototropism. So phototropism is plant growth that's influenced by the presence of light. And this is actually due to auxins. And I need you to remember that. So auxins are produced in the plant. When auxins are produced in the plant, they move away from the light source to the shaded side of the stem. So see the auxin molecules that are depicted here as these little red circles. So auxins on the shaded side of the stem stimulate a greater rate of growth than on the side with less auxin. So where there's auxin, there's more growth, okay? Causing the plant to bend towards the light. So if you've ever wondered why when you have your plant, say you're in a house and you have a house plant and you put it, in the window and it starts bending towards the light that's in the window, that's because it's actually producing more auxins on that shaded side so that these cells grow more, which is going to make it bend in the direction of the light, which is really cool. Now, plants also have something called gravitropism. And so this is where plant stems grow away from the force of gravity. So if you've ever wondered why you put a seed in the dirt and somehow it knows to put the roots down and the stem and the leaves up, it's because of gravitropism. And so in response to gravity, a root will grow downward, where it's most likely to find water. In contrast, a stem will grow upward where it is most likely to find light. So plants are actually responding to the force of gravity. And so starches within the cells of the stem basically sink downward in response to gravity, triggering the movement of auxin towards them. Remember, auxin is our growth hormone, right? And so auxin then stimulates faster growth where it occurs in higher concentration, causing the stem to bend upwards, right? Here's my auxin, which means I'm going to have more growth here where the auxin is. And that's how basically that stem is basically growing up, through the soil. And that's it. That's the basics of what I need you to understand in plant structure, nutrition, and environmental response. I've got some extra supplementary materials that I'm going to load into the lecture module. So it just explains in greater depth about these very same concepts, but hopefully that explains these concepts that could be a little bit difficult to understand without having a little bit greater explanation. So be sure to check out some of those supplementary materials. I've got extra in your pages, view all pages, supplementary materials. You've got some extra videos in there, but I'll try to grab the ones that could be most helpful and drop them in the module so you don't have to go searching around. That's it for this week's lecture, and I'll see you guys at the next lecture. Thanks.